Order, please. We'll call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts to order. I'd like to, just before we begin, send out a reminder to all those in attendance if they could please place their phones on silent or vibrate. Before we get into the introduction of the committee members, I'd like to acknowledge staff here. The Auditor General and one staff member is here, along with committee office and Ledge Council. So we'll begin with the introductions and start with Ms. LeBlanc.
Good morning, I'm Susan LeBlanc. I'm the MLA for Dartmouth North.
Good morning, I am Lisa Roberts, the MLA for Halifax Needham. Nice to see you.
Good morning and welcome. My name is Tim Hallman, MLA for Dartmouth East.
Good morning, I'm Margaret Miller, the MLA for Hants East.
Good morning and welcome. Leo Glavine, member of Kings West.
Benjamin Jessam from Hammonds Plains, Lucasville.
Good morning, everyone. Brendan McGuire, Halifax Atlantic.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Bill Horn, MLA for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank, subbing today for Hugh McKay of Chester St. Margaret's.
And I guess I should make myself known too. I'm Keith Bain. I'm the chair of the Public Accounts Committee. So on today's agenda, we have officials from Workers' Compensation Board and the Department of Labour and Advanced Education with us to discuss Chapter 3 from the May 2019 Auditor General Report relating to worker compensation claims management, and Chapter 3 from the December 2018 Auditor General Report relating to WCB governance and long-term sustainability. So we'll begin by asking the witnesses to introduce themselves first, and then I believe, Mr. Montgomerie, you're going to be leading the pack. So please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Rod Burgar. I'm chair of the Workers' Compensation Board.
Mr. Chair, I'm Stuart MacLean. I'm the CEO of the Workers' Compensation Board.
Good morning, I'm Shelley Rowan. I'm the Vice President of Prevention and Service Delivery, basically the Operations Vice President at the WCB.
Duff Montgomerie, Deputy Minister of Labour and Advanced Education, Workers' Compensation Board, and the Nova Scotia Apprenticeship Agency.
Good morning, I'm Christine Penney. I'm the Senior Executive Director for the Safety Branch of Labour and Advanced Education.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Montgomerie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to begin by thanking you for the invitation to appear before your committee. We always appreciate the opportunity to be here with the work, and we appreciate the opportunity to be here today with the Workers' Compensation Board to answer questions related to the Auditor General's Spring 2019 and Fall 2018 reports. In the Auditor General's 2018 report on board governance and long-term sustainability, it was found that the model is working well and the long-term sustainability is strong. The WCB needed to make major changes to achieve a solid footing, and I can't tell you how pleased I am to say that the unfunded liability is now expected to be eliminated between 2020 and 2024, well ahead of the original target date of 2039. I'd particularly like to recognize the progress achieved by the board in working towards eliminating WCB's unfunded liability. And we also recognize the employees and employers have also been a large part of this effort. It's hard to put a price on the effort of the board since 2000, roughly, to put aside benefits, to put aside lower rates, to get rid of this unfunded liability. They are to be applauded. When the Auditor General informed us of the audit, I welcomed it. I believe it's important to look at our organizations from time to time to see what is working and what needs improvement. The Auditor General has provided an insightful report with meaningful recommendations. Implementing them is a priority for all of us. The government and its agencies need to be accountable to the public. It's also important for us to always, every day, ask, how can we better serve Nova Scotians? Our colleagues at the WCB are here to discuss the work they're doing and their support for the recommendations. The WCB is an arm's-length organization operating independently within their scope of authority. The government's role is the responsibility for the legislative and regulatory framework and for board appointments. I believe partnerships are key to having a collective impact for Nova Scotians. We work with WCB on many fronts and collaborate on projects and initiatives with a joint multi-year plan. This relationship started with the workplace safety strategy, has continued to strengthen from there. You may have seen recent awareness campaigns, workplace injuries hurt us most at home, but there is more. We jointly sponsor and fund organizations and projects like Society for Farm Safety, Nova Scotia, Aware Nova Scotia, Discovery Center Science and Safety Project. We have a shared focus on reducing injuries in the fishing sector, a huge challenge. And we jointly support industry conferences and other safety-related issues. Supporting injured workers is important to us, and WCB has a 100-year history of leading this work for Nova Scotians. Injured workers deserve to have an accessible, comprehensive appeals process available to them. Appeals volume has decreased. This is good news, but the length of time it takes for an appeal decision is too long, and we can do better for injured workers. Outside of the Auditor General's welcome recommendations, we're committing to reviewing our appeals process to make it more efficient. Before the Auditor General announced he was going to do a report, we had started to look at the Workers' Advisors Program, the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal, and the WCB and ourselves together to look and see how we can make the appeals system better. We parked that process. We're now reopening it now that the Auditor General's report is done, and we will move on that fairly quickly. We will assess the findings and make the necessary enhancements to the appeals system to help injured workers get the benefits they need sooner. Implementing the Auditor General's recommendations is a shared priority. We know there's more work to be done, and we are committed to working collaboratively with our partners to strengthen workplace safety. Mr. Chair, thank you again for asking us here today, and I look forward to answering any questions from the members. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Montgomerie. I'll turn it over now to Mr. Burgar. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to be here today as chair of the WCB. In my role as chair, I've had direct oversight of both Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the audit. And I, like the Deputy Minister, actually welcomed that audit. I think Crown corporations and near Crown corporations need to be highly transparent and accountable for the work they do. I also want to acknowledge the very professional approach that the Auditor General took. We were obviously deeply engaged with his office over quite a period of time, and whenever we met, and I had the opportunity to meet with him several times, I found him to be exceptionally professional, very constructive in his comments and recommendations. Well, today is obviously about the Auditor General's report and governance and operations. I do want to remind all of us and ourselves that the reason we're here as WCB is about prevention of injury, and when workers are injured, helping them get back to work. That's what gets us up in the day. That's what drives Shelley's team every day, day in and day out. So while process and documentation and so on and so forth are all very important, I know that as a lawyer, the real work is in Shelley's hands, and helping those workers get back to work when they're injured is really paramount. As you know, Phase 1 of the audit report was focused on corporate governance. I was overall very pleased with the findings that we have very good corporate governance in place. I know that our board works, very hard and diligently at that. There's always room for improvements. There were 3 recommendations coming out of Phase 1. We've accepted those 3 recommendations and are acting on them now. Like the deputy, I was pleased and gratified that the Auditor General particularly acknowledged the work we've done on the unfunded liability. And in that regard, I want to acknowledge our Chief Financial Officer. He's not here today, but Leo McKenna has been the steward of that through various board iterations and various chairs. So I'm kind of standing on the shoulders of others. I just happen to be at the right place at the right time when all of that hard work and discipline is coming together. And the result of that is that we're 90% funded approximately today. This can go up and down according to the markets, of course, and our experience ratings. But but it's a huge, huge move forward. And as the deputy said, we expect to be at 100% or more in the next 2 to 4 years. So that's great news. If I had to, I want to acknowledge my colleagues at the board. I think when the Auditor General recognized and pointed out that we have good corporate governance, I would, if I had to identify one single factor, I think it's the makeup of our board. As you know, we have a multi-stakeholder board consisting of labor and management representatives. And if you know any of the individuals on the board, if you look at names like Rick Clark, Janet Hazelton, and Luke Urchevik, these people are strong advocates, and they bring important issues to our board table. And I have the pleasure of chairing that board and reaching consensus wherever we can on important issues. But they're very strong advocates, and they don't let you off the hook at any particular time. So it's a real pleasure to work with them. The second phase of the audit concerned our operations, and as you know, Stuart and Shelley are here to sort of answer questions around operations. That's their wheelhouse, not mine. The Auditor General found that overall we were achieving our mandate, following our policies and achieving what we needed to achieve in that second audit. But he did make 12 important recommendations, and Stuart and Shelley can speak to that later. But we've also accepted those 12 recommendations, and we're working to implement various changes around those recommendations. From a governance point of view, what I've asked Stuart to do is to regularly report into our Finance and Audit and Risk Committee of the board. And the chair of that committee will be overseeing the implementation of the recommendations as we go forward. In addition, we'll be reporting from time to time directly to the Auditor General's office on our progress. And the reason we're doing that, we're not required to do that, but we as I said at the outset, we feel transparency and accountability is extremely important, and I take that very seriously as chair. So I'm more than willing and happy to report our progress as we go. I think that's really all I have to say, Mr. Chair. Thank you for inviting us here today. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And before we move on to you, Mr. MacLean, I'm going to ask everybody to please speak into the mic. In order to make it bearable here, we have the fans going, and if you could speak into the mic, that'd be greatly appreciated. So, Mr. Burgar, thank you very much. Mr. MacLean.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As our board chair pointed out, this audit has been a major priority of our organization over the last couple of years. And we have worked closely with the staff who are here today, some of them, and appreciative of the collaborative and constructive dialogue that we've had throughout that process. I think there's been a lot of learning. It has identified priorities, and I'll get to that in a second. But I've been with the WCB for more than 30 years, so I've seen the liability that we've talked about. It was 27% funded when I first joined the organization, so we've clearly come a long way. But the reason, and Rod spoke to this, but the reason we do what we do is for the people that we serve. We're personally driven every day to prevent injuries, to get, when an injury happens, to help workers recover and get back to work. We are in the people business in this province. And when that is not possible, we support workers. We support their families in living with a serious workplace injury or tragedy. And I can tell you, as somebody who's worked in the system, when you've met with the widows and the survivors and the people who've been have industrial disease and the people who have been seriously injured, this is very serious business for us, and we recognize that all injuries need to be prevented. We're proud of the contribution we make in this province. We look back in the last 10 or 15 years, funding is not just the only thing. Injuries are down considerably. People are getting back to work quicker than they did 10 or 15 years ago. There's less disability. All those things are important. Last year was a particularly tragic year in our workplaces. We know we're safer. However, last year we had a lot of fatalities. We had 40 fatalities, both. We could talk about that if that's what the committee chooses. But I think everyone here would agree that one serious injury, one industrial disease, or one fatality the phrase one too many really does apply. And when an injury occurs, we know we need to be there, but we really need to get ahead of that and prevent those injuries in the first place. We're pleased that overall the audit found that we're fulfilling our mandate. And having said that, I think there's a lot of improvements and learnings that come out of that. As the chair mentioned, we agree with all 12 recommendations. We're already working to implement them. Now that we've had a chance to synthesize what it will take, we've acted immediately on a number. In fact, we had an executive committee Tuesday, and 4 of those are moving ahead, right now. So we've added some resources and done some different things. The recommendations are also coming at a time when we're modernizing and adapting to new systems. So if you can think about it, we used to be in a paper-based world with fax machines, and it was very difficult when you're dealing with 25,000 claims that are people who have already been injured or some kind of a permanent disability, plus another 24,000 claims coming in every year. When you're paper and fax, it's hard to adjust to that. But when we're going to leverage technology, we're going to actually try to become part of the solution here in terms of getting people back to work, improving the flow of information. We've modernized. And these learnings of the audit come at an opportune time because they're going to basically inform the configuration of our new work processes. So undoubtedly, we're going to benefit from this audit. There's no question about that. And as staff, we thank you for the opportunity and we look forward to the questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll begin questions. The first round will be 20 minutes for each caucus. We'll begin with the PC caucus. Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your service to the residents of Nova Scotia. Thank you very much for your opening remarks. One of the key themes that came out of the opening remarks was your commitment to transparency and accountability, fundamentals in any democratic society. With respect to that, I think we'd all agree that responding to applicants, responding in a written way, in a timely manner is fundamental to transparency and accountability. And certainly the Auditor General's report indicates that there's still some work that needs to be done with respect to that. So I'd like to take a few moments with you to ask some questions related to completing written decisions on a timely basis. And it's my understanding that the internal policy states that written decisions given to a worker should be completed within 2 days of that decision being made. However, my understanding on the ground, management noted that the way it's implemented, it's a 30-day practice. So I'm curious, why has the internal policy protocol of 2 days shifted to the much longer 30-day period?
Mr. MacLean.
Thank you. The question of timeliness and documentation were key themes in the audit. There's no question about that. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that is going to help us in that regard is the modernization that we're going through. As you can probably appreciate as a committee, getting the decision right is a really important thing for us. And when we're compiling files to make decisions, we're getting information from the injured worker, we're getting information from the employer, we're getting information from a medical advisor. You may be waiting for information from a specialist. So these types of things, all of these things can cause delays in timeliness. The practical struggle that we make, and with the 2-day, we recognize the 2-day policy challenges. It's almost impossible to actually achieve that. However, we know we need to do better. We know that timeliness and documentation are important to the injured worker. We know that people are waiting. Most people will receive a payment so they don't have a disruption of earnings. So we know that timeliness of payment in 14 days is an important measure for us, and we look to that. But we do recognize that we can do much better in terms of the way we document and the way we communicate. New technology of having the way to correspond electronically rather than through the mail, rather than through fax machines, which most Nova Scotians don't have a fax machine. So an injured worker, it's a challenge when they have to have a paper form and get it to us. It's a challenge for us when we need to communicate with the injured worker and when they get into their hands. There's no question there's some learnings there that the audit committee found that, they're really, really long. And I'm going to turn it to Shelley just to make additional comments around that because she has the more of the insight on the individual question.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got to recognize everybody here. I keep forgetting about this. I have to look at my list here. I'm sorry, I'm not sure of the names. It's Rowan. Sorry, I apologize.
Thank you for the question. Over the last few years, we've tried to make improvements in our decision-making process and our communications process. So even over the last few months, we've tried to improve the way we communicate with workers and employers through the life of the claim, not just at the decision-making point. And for example, we now require caseworkers to be in touch with both the worker, the employer, and the healthcare provider very early on in the claim so that there's a better understanding of the work and what the expectations are. Regarding written decisions, we've tried to make our decisions easier to read. Our decisions, if you'd ever read them over the years, they were long, they were legalistic, they included big sections of the Workers' Compensation Act. People had a hard time understanding them. And so we've put a lot of effort into writing decisions that are less complex and easier to understand. And it simply has taken us longer to produce those than it did the big legal type decisions that we did in the past. So we need to look at our process to make sure from the time we communicate verbally a decision to a worker to the time they receive their written decision, that the time frame has to be short in between those 2 points. And it's part of the work that we'll do coming out of this audit. Also, as Stuart said, we believe we'll achieve some administrative efficiency with our new systems. It will help us in that regard, but we need to set new standards because you're correct. We currently have a standard that we're not meeting.
Mr. Hallman.
And Mr. MacLean, if I understood you correctly, you've been involved with workers' compensation for 30 years, right? 33 years. So with all that sort of corporate memory, I'm curious as to, looking back, if you could outline for Nova Scotians, how did we go from a 2-day expectation to what's actually happening a 30-day period? I think, learning from what's happened and then implementing new procedures, we all agree that's critical. But could you outline for us, how we got to that point where, on paper it said 2 days, but in its practical application it was a 30-day period?
Mr. MacLean.
Thank you. Well, I can tell you that when I joined the board 33 years ago, this was before the introduction of cell phones and personal computers. So we've come a long way. We had paper registers back in the day, and in fact, I joined the board as a result of an Auditor General report recommendation where we needed to bolster the finance department. I came in the accounting area at that time. So I can tell you that things were very different. Decisions were made, but a lot of times you were relying on a letter, and I think Shelley spoke to this, and I'll see if I can just sort of, bear down on that a little bit for you. But if you have a letter that goes out that people don't understand and you're communicating the decision, that's really not good enough. It takes more than 2 days to actually write the decision, to get the decision written, to get it communicated when you're dealing with a lot of these things coming at us on a regular basis. There's I don't know, I'd have to hazard a guess at how many decisions, because we're dealing with 24,000 claims a year. We got 25,000 people on permanent disability. And those people, we make decisions on those files. People are making requests there as well. So there's a volume element to it, and there's a lot of moving parts. And certainly tools will help us in that regard. I don't think 2 days is the right time frame in terms of giving it back to a caseworker who already has a caseload and having a letter come out. However, communicating verbally the decision, having a phone call, we've got to look at all of that and how we actually go forward. And again, in my opening comments, I mentioned with this new technology, with the modernization, we've implemented Guidewire, which is an insurance system that's an AMS in the cloud solution, which will give our staff tools. And we simply can't be part of the delay or creating return to work through making things take longer. I think that's what you're really bearing down on. And we recognize that we have to do our part. For many years, in the WCB system, with our partners at Environment and Labor, we focused on injury prevention. And I'm very pleased with that we're 35% less than where we were in terms of the number of injuries coming in the door than we were, say, 10 or 12 years ago. However, what we've done in the last couple of years is we have a strategic plan. The strategic plan, our stakeholders, our staff told us we need better tools. Our stakeholders told us we need to interact differently with you. it's time for the board to invest in modernization. That's where this came from. So the timeliness of the recommendations of the Auditor General's report, landing with us to basically say, what should those standards be? How is the workflow going to be? Because we've been through a major business transformation in the last 2 or 3 years, and we're just live with it now. And it's everything from the competencies for caseworkers to make sure they have the skills to do the job, so we're not promoting people into jobs that they can't do. It's got all of our processes are changed, all of our screens, the different tools, so people will have reminders that will have, for example, when a new claim takes place, we'll have the ability to have a follow-up or make sure we communicate with that case, with that injured worker, rather than the injured worker just gets a letter in the mail. So we're trying to improve service. We're trying to make it better. And at the end of the day, I can tell you a long time ago, you wouldn't even want to measure it because we wouldn't even have had a way to measure it. We didn't have proper statistics. We didn't have corporate performance measures. We didn't have a functioning board that basically was involved in the governance and oversight and have a clean governance audit like this. We didn't have a bipartite board at that time. So we've come light years ahead in terms of governance. We've come light years ahead in terms of understanding what the issues are, and we are taking active steps to try to improve the things that the Auditor General, we're already on a path, but some of the findings, there's some findings here, quite frankly, that were very disturbing for all of us, and we're taking action on those. So I'm not sure if that helps much, but certainly we can do better. We understand the impact on the injured worker and on the employer in this case, and we're trying to improve the system and be the right partner for our employers and injured workers in Nova Scotia.
Mr. Hallman.
And certainly everyone I know appreciates your commitment and desire for improvement. There's no doubt about that. I'm curious though, am I correct in saying that the sort of the unofficial 30-day policy, was that a management decision? Am I correct in saying that?
Mr. MacLean.
It's not a formal policy of the board. The way, I know I'm not going to teach anybody here in the legislature how things work, but there's the legislation, and then basically it gives the policies of the board the power of law. And then we have informal policies, which we have lots of them. Many companies, they might call them a procedure, where if you set a 2-day or a 3-day or 30-day, those procedures then are what's utilized by staff to be in compliance with. And, and it's going to be in time to update that clearly. But at this point, it's been management that basically where we've done that. We report to the board on a suite of corporate performance measures, everything from injury prevention per 100 workers to return to work outcomes to return on our investment portfolio to satisfaction measures. There's a whole, and we have a lot of rigor around all of that, but we need to do better. And I think that's the key thing here.
Mr. Hallman.
Certainly the source of frustrations for many people when they deal with various government agencies, government departments, is often the discrepancy between what's formally stated as a policy and what actually happens on the ground. And certainly when people are, if I can say this respectfully, in a state of crisis, what they read as a formal policy and then discover isn't being implemented on the ground is an enormous source of frustration. I think we would all agree that a fundamental characteristic of transparency and accountability, there has to be consistency between what's officially stated and what officially happens. So to that end, I mean, I certainly, I'm pleased to hear that you're committed to changing that. What is it within the department's culture that you're actively trying to change so that there is no discrepancy between what is formally stated and what happens on the ground?
Mr. MacLean.
I think we have a lot of rigor around a lot of the things that we do. There's no question about that. And I think this is an area, as I mentioned, where there is opportunity. I can't tell you the frustration we feel when we have fax, we're relying on keying in fax machines with incomplete information and all the different things that go along with that. That caseworker wants the information to make the decision, and they're out hunting for information, and that can be challenging. I don't know what more I can say with regards to this. I think it really comes down to we are strategically working with our board making an investment to improve the tools which will help address some of these issues, and we need to bring our informal policies in alignment with practice. That doesn't mean we put the practice out to 30 days or 60 days or whatever that means to be. We got to figure out what actually makes sense. Have that dialogue with our Finance, Audit and Risk Committee, because it is in the scope of this audit. We will be reporting to them on a regular basis as we implement all 12 of these recommendations. And that's what this is for. You know, there's learnings here, and we've got to take that forward.
Mr. Burgar, you want to comment, Mr. Burgar?
If I may just follow on to Stuart's comments, at a corporate governance level, I would suggest that the essence of the Auditor General's report is about responsiveness to injured workers and the employers who employ those individuals. It's about as you note, a time of anxiety, crisis. They're injured. Money's in question, and so on. All those are big pressures, and in that environment, we want to be as responsive as we can be. And I think you've heard Shelley indicate that she's made some immediate changes to how we're responding to both employers and injured workers, to bring them, put them in the picture earlier, and continue to keep them informed. The question of policy and so on, I would like to sort of split your question, if I might. We are very transparent, I think, and I think this is in a funny sense. This is the Auditor General was pleased with the ground that he sort of found in our organization, because we are very transparent. We know we have this obligation. The compensation system, the insurance system, is paid by employers, not government money. And we have an obligation to the stakeholders to account for everything we do, and we take that so seriously. So, and sometimes that can be your undoing, because we document everything, including our policies and so on. As Stuart indicated, we're in a massive time of change, and that it's hard to say how shocking it was when I came in as chair 3.5 years ago. Your iPhone has more technology than the whole WCB system had. Seriously, 3.5 years ago. You could do more with your iPhone than these caseworkers could do on their desk. It was shocking. And you know, the fax thing, you think it's being made up, but everything was coming in by fax. Can you imagine? You know, and being typed in. Unbelievable. So all of that has been changed. There's been a massive modernization, and we call it modernization, but for all of us in the world of digital technology, it's just being on Main Street. You know, it's the way you do business with your bank and your broker and your doctors and so on. So all of that's in play right now, and it will, for sure, deliver better service. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The Auditor General, in a way, has reaffirmed the business case for the investment we made in that massive modernization.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hammond, with about 2.5 minutes left in your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's take a look at the internal approach with respect to appeals and the targeted time frame of those appeals. It's stated, if I've understood correctly, that with workers' compensation, to complete an appeal from the date of notice of an appeal, it's to be done within 90 days. However, in a number of cases, the reality was 140 to 458 days. And this is substantially different from the stated, I guess, policy or outcome that wishes to be achieved. Workers' Compensation Board, it's countered that the targets are based upon business days. I'm curious if the WCB, could you outline the amount of complaints you've received with respect to the appeal process? So that's quite the discrepancy in some cases.
Mr. MacLean?
So I'd start out just to say when the Auditor General came in, we did have some vacancies in positions in appeals. We have the appeal volume has come down subsequent. The numbers of the longer term, I'm going to turn that to Shelley in a second, but we have, as an organization, since the Auditor General's report came out, added additional resources in internal appeals and also with regards to mental health claims. So there's a number of responsive things where we've seen growth that the board has supported us in actually making some change. Shelley, could you speak to the question around the
Ms. Rowan,
numbers?
with just 1 minute left in this round. So.
Talk really fast. In internal appeals, in the period that the Auditor General looked at, we had had a spike in appeals. They've gone up about 15% over that couple of years, and there was more appeals than we could meet the timeline for. So we had received a few complaints. If you look at our annual report, our Client Relations Officer has a report in there every year, and timeliness would be one of the things that they highlight. We have had a concentrated effort over the last 6 months to improve that, and we have significantly reduced the number of appeals that are waiting. And for the number of appeals over 90 days, which 90 days is our timeline, we're down to just 30 that are over the 90 days, and some of those are complicated for different reasons. So we have made progress. Over 90 days is too long. The intention is to have it be a quick process, quick resolution, and to help the person get resolution to their issue and so that they can move on to the next stage.
Thank you. The time for the PC Caucus is up for this round. Now I'll provide 20 minutes to the NDP Caucus. Ms. LeBlanc.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for being here and for your comments so far. I just wanted to clarify an answer that you gave to my colleague earlier. When you were talking about the timeline, for a case to be resolved or to be decided on, you mentioned that workers do get a payment so that there's no interruption. Can you just clarify what that means? So do they get a payment from workers' compensation, and then if their claim turns out to be denied, do they repay that, or how does that all work?
Ms. Rowan.
When an employer or worker files a claim, the WCB relatively quickly will make a decision on whether or not that claim is approved, and generally that happens within the first couple of weeks of a claim, and the payment would begin immediately. What we were talking about earlier is written decisions. So essentially at the end of a claim is when we would issue a written decision. And a big written decision is generally only provided when we are terminating benefits. If someone just comes in, needs some health care, misses a few days from work, we pay some financial benefits and they go back to work, we never issue a formal decision. They get a letter saying that they're approved, but it's not a formal, complex decision. So the majority of people, I think it's over 90% of people within the first couple of weeks, we approve those claims and they are in pay, and people are getting the health care they need. We're working with them to get them back to work. The written decisions only come for when we deny benefits at the end or when benefits are terminated.
Ms. LeBlanc.
And so is there anything to protect people while they're waiting for, if it is a more complicated case? I know that I've had people come into my office where they're waiting for a resolution, and they have no income. And so they're in housing crisis, they're having to go to food banks while they're waiting for these things. Is there any protection for people while the decision is being made?
Ms. Rowan.
Because the Workers' Compensation Board only provides benefits for work-related injury, if there is a question as to whether or not an injury or an illness is related to work, many times that's a very straightforward process, but there are times when it can be complicated, and so we don't pay benefits until we've determined if it actually is work-related. So that is what can cause a delay at the front end. There is no question to that.
Ms. LeBlanc.
I'm going to turn my questions now to the letter that Jason MacLean, who's the president of the NSGEU, wrote to the Auditor General following the report. He pointed out in that letter some relevant issues that were not addressed in the Auditor General's report. In examining policies and procedures, staffing levels, and workload, they were not considered in the audit. Given that weaknesses identified included timeliness, it seems that it would be relevant to consider staffing levels and capacity to deal with the approximately 24,000 claims that WCB receives each year. So my first question is, how do you see the issues identified in this report as being related to staffing levels and current workload or caseload?
Mr. MacLean.
Thank you. When you're dealing with limited resources, I'll say, you have to be recognized that we all operate with constraints. We know that in our healthcare system. There's so much that you can do. We have so many people. We have to be smart with how we actually leverage resources. One of the things that we know from experience with other jurisdictions is the modernization that we spoke about earlier should result in our organization over time being about 15% smaller. That's what they've seen by the introduction of the technology and of the tools. There's no question that our staff feel workload issues. I think most organizations where there's a lot of tough work to do, where you have issues like timeliness is an issue, the frustrations that we've already been talking about here today, that the people feel the burden of that because they're dealing face-to-face with the injured worker. This is a people business, and they have to talk to people about when can you have your money, all those different types of things. When do you get your benefits? When do you get your services? So we're always very conscious that every dollar that we collect has an impact on the economy. We're always conscious of doing the best we can with the dollar. Over 80% of all the dollars in our budget go towards the injured worker, and the rest of it is to fund the system, which we fund that Department of Labor, Workers Advisors Program, the Workers' Comp Appeals Tribunal, other organizations and agencies. So when you look at the staff component, we believe we're properly staff resourced for the work that we need to do, but we also know that if we can become more efficient, and we're not keying in those faxes anymore, and that's not an expense, that our board has a chance to leverage those resources to do value-added work, that the tools will help us become more efficient, and we'll have some flexibility. We have, I think, a lot of money that gets spent on administration, and we have to be responsible with all of that as we move forward. So I think it's a challenge, and Jason is the president of the union that represents our workforce. We are NSGEU local. So I have ongoing dialogue with Jason on a regular basis and understand his issues and concerns, and we take them into consideration.
Mr. Burgar.
If I might just respond a little bit to that question at a higher level, more at the governance level. I've met a number of times with Jason and understand his concerns. And what I would like to say, though, is both the NSGEU and the Federation of Labor specifically refer to WCB as being one of the best employer-employee relationships in the province. So yes, we have our days and moments and so on, as you would in any labor union environment. But the overall relationship is excellent. This change we're talking about, this modernization, has acutely been of interest to the NSGEU because it can impact on jobs. The bigger impact, I think, is in transferring skills to new positions and utilizing skills for new positions. And Shelley and her colleague Wendy Griffin, who's the VP of HR, have worked tirelessly to integrate people into new positions. And we've worked with the NSGEU all through the piece. There's been complete transparency. We have a working committee that is ongoing all the time. So I feel, at least at a chair level, not complacent, but comfortable that the relationship with the NSGEU and people generally are being well managed in a thoughtful way. I can tell you that from a performance point of view, one of the key performance indicators that we see at the board level is around our people, talent, and we survey them regularly with outside surveyors, independent surveyors, who give us, very clear feedback on how they're feeling, and we've done that particularly through this arc of the last 3 years as this modernization occurs, and to Shelley's credit, and certainly Stuart's. The overall indicators are very positive and strong, notwithstanding the amount of change that's going on. So just more context. Thank you.
Mr. MacLean, you wanted to...
Shelley's just going to add additional.
I think I'm okay, actually. I'd love to.
Okay,
Okay, great.
We'll
Thank
move
you.
on. Ms. LeBlanc.
So currently, the WCB is down to 8 term positions and 1 permanent caseworker. So I'm wondering how long it takes to fill vacancies, and what's being done right now to fill those positions promptly, and how many vacancies currently exist in the staffing makeup for caseworkers?
Ms. Rowan.
So over the last couple of years, we've done a few things to try to be more flexible in our staffing. With case managers in particular, they are our most senior case workers. Last year, the board supported us in adding case manager float positions that would help us if we had short-term vacancies, that we would be able to have somebody ready and available to put in those positions. And if we were having peaks and flows of work, that we would be able to allocate caseworkers to those positions, and that has helped us. But we have had vacancies in addition to that. And over the years, we have often filled those more senior positions from within the organization, and that's changed over the last couple of years, and we're now doing more hiring outside. So we did end up in the position this year where we had 8 case manager positions that were vacant, and we were trying to hire them. A couple of those were new positions that we had created to deal with the claims that are coming from the new presumption from PTSD, the PTSD legislation. So our HR department has been very proactive in trying to fill positions, but there is no question it has taken us longer than we had anticipated to find good quality candidates to do the work. So we are in the midst of those 8 vacancies. I believe we have 3 of those that are now filled. We are actively interviewing, and with the intention that those would be filled by early this fall.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Thanks. Mr. Burgar, you mentioned that you do survey the workers. I'm wondering what information are you collecting about employee satisfaction and the root of the recruitment retention problems? Are you getting any sense from the workers about why it might be taking longer to fill those positions? And when you do receive information that might be, in the good sense, critical, what's being done to address the issues when they're identified?
Mr. Burgar.
Thank you for your question. I'm going to have to turn it to Shelley in respect to some details, but I don't have the survey at hand, but it's quite a comprehensive survey. I think if it was before us, we would all recognize the different types of questions and criteria. We've been doing it for a number of years, so it's well benchmarked against past performance. The things that we've been trying to keep an eye on at a board level are around, for lack of I'll roll this all up, but it's really morale. How are people feeling when they come into work during this period of massive change? And I've run many change management projects as a professional, and you can lose your people, and that's a really high risk, because as Stuart said, we're in the people business, and we need our employees focused on that. So that's what I've been trying to keep an eye on. It's very steady. It's within a range of like 71 to 73% satisfaction overall. So frankly, it's surprising to me, given my other experiences on other work I've done. But I think in a positive way, it's a credit to Shelley and Wendy and Stuart who are leading those people. I think 2 things. We at the board level have approved very substantial budgets around change management. And we've worked with Jason on all of that. Spent a lot of time, and time costs money, and we've approved the budget. So we feel it's an investment in our organization and in our people to oversee this change and the change management that goes with it and the people side effectively. So we've been very comfortable with that. Shelley, I don't know if you can add anything about
or some process, if that's.
Yep.
Mr. MacLean.
Thank you. Just a couple things I'd add to our chairman's comment. The surveys are actually conducted by a third party, so we have the staff interact with them. We do report to the board on that on a regular basis. Just the number did take a dip last year. We've never had a number, well, once, one other time, there was less than 70%, but it's taken a bit of a dip. It was actually at the end of the year last year, 66%. We believe that's attributable to what our chairman's speaking to, the change management. People, when you're going to change everything and you can't tell them what it's all going to look like, and then you say, okay, now how do you like it so far? And then now they understand a little bit better about that. So we had a bit of a dip in that, but we do take it very seriously to the point that, as an example, each vice president, the CEO, our executive team, we read every verbatim. So the comments that come in, they're obviously blinded. They don't say who they're coming from, but we get them from all areas of the organization saying, this is what I like, this is what I don't like. Our staff are very committed to our mandate. We have very low turnover. We have 90% completion of that survey, which talks about the commitment of the organization and the organization's people. They know it's useful. They know we listen to it. They know we act on it. That survey is pushed down to every operational unit. They discuss the outcomes for their individual unit, and they make changes as they move forward. That's what you do when you learn from, from a survey, just like we're going to do from the audit today.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Thanks. So I'd like to ask a couple questions about Guidewire now. You've referenced several times this massive change in the organization, so I want to just get into that a little bit. Number one, my understanding is that the implementation of... Maybe they heard us my own thing. There we go. The implementation began in June, so it's only a month and a half now, but wondering if you can speak a little bit about how things are going with the transition, and what is the timeline for the complete Guidewire implementation?
Mr. MacLean.
Thank you. Guidewire has been a project that's been in play for a couple of years to get ready. So there's a lot of the pre-work that goes into it. There's a lot of work, as our chairman spoke to, of change management. Change management is a huge piece of this because we need our people to work effectively with new tools that are all going to change. The way they did it for 30 years now is going to be different as of in June, as you mentioned. It is early days. As we go through the implementation, we were very pleased that we're on time, on budget. Those things are good. That we have stability. There's a lot of things that you look for initially because you got to get it up and running. There's always the challenges of the firsts. So the first time you run a statement of account, the first time you have a pension run, the first time you run the medical aid statements, are they going to work the way they were planned, the way they were tested in the pre-phase? There's been some bumpiness to that, there's no question, but the team is working very hard to work on those things, and staff have been patient because we need to also get around to fixing some of the things that are inherent in these types of implementations. To put an exclamation mark on it, Guidewire, a lot of other jurisdictions in Canada would do their claim system, or they do their policy system, or they do their registry system. We've done it all at once, so it's a very complex integration. So when we're only weeks into it, I think we'd like to be better off than where we are towards getting it to stabilize. But we don't see any challenges that we can't take on. We have a board oversight committee that looks after us on the transformation. So we meet with them almost every couple of weeks. They're looking at risk with external risk advisors. There's a very healthy dialogue. Staff are engaged. We're having employee roundtable sessions to understand the staff. And Shelley and I have personally been around to the desks of most people in the organization to ask them how they're feeling about it. What's the lessons learned from it, and what do we need to be able to do? What are the current priorities? You need to be nimble, with this type of an implementation, and our team has worked hard with the integrator and with the other consultants that are involved in this. And I know overall we're you know, we have challenges. There's still challenges for us to get through, but we're pleased that we're up and running with these new tools. I just would remind the committee that the systems that were in place were built back in the 80s, and I think it was 92 was one half of it. The early part of it was in the late 80s. So we're talking about green screen technology where we did have technology. So this is integrated. We've got partners with Canada Revenue, with Medivy, and all of those things are working, right? So we have the fundamentals. We're paying claims. We're able to get the money in. People are paying. Our revenue is coming in. And our staff, while there's some challenges, they're being patient. But one of our values as an organization is to have a can-do attitude, and people have stepped up to that in a big way. And I'm very proud of them, our staff, as how they've been responsive and how they're, when we have challenges, how they step up for the injured worker and the employer.
Ms. LeBon, 1 minute left.
All right. Well, I'll just stay on this then. So speaking of the staff and the great amount of work and the can-do attitude and all of those things, what are you doing to provide support for staff who may be feeling a lot of pressure in this transition time, either because, you know, case loads are high, you know, there's positions needing to be filled, this massive transition happening all at once. You know, what are you doing to ensure that you don't have worker burnout and, you know, that it all falls apart in a couple of weeks after it's too much? No.
Mr. MacLean,
Thank you,
20
sir.
seconds.
Thank you, second. Okay. We have a lot of people focused on making sure our people make a successful transition. We've introduced float positions that the board has approved to support people. We've introduced coaches for people to actually understand how the new system works, because you get trained, then you go back and it's all different and you forget, and then they get frustrated. So there's no question that this is a big challenge, but we've taken a best practice approach from our consultants, and we've implemented that with board oversight.
Order, please. We now will move on to the Liberal Caucus. We have 20 minutes. Mr. Jessup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, thank you everyone for your time here this morning and certainly for your ongoing work. I will make an effort to wrap up with a positive, but I'll make an effort to be a little bit critical for the first little while. Initially, I'd like to focus a little bit on the focus of the Auditor General's report around how complaints are handled at the WCB. Through the chair, would one of our guests or a couple of our guests provide some commentary kind of on a start to finish on how complaints are accepted, triaged, and then managed beyond deciding on what to do?
Mr. MacLean.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Jessup, the complaints are something that we take very seriously. In fact, in 1998, the Auditor General's report recommended the establishment of a client relations officer. Our client relations officer's name is Tim McGuinness. Tim does a lot of great work. I'm sure most MLAs here know Tim and have had some experience with Tim. Tim helps a lot of people, and I stand behind Tim 100% in the work that he does. What the Auditor General helped us understand is that there's a lot of room for improvement in the way that we actually deal with complaints. And we've acted immediately on that. As an example, we were very informal with the way we would decide, is it a complaint, is it not a complaint? And a lot of that was left to the purview of the client relations officer. I should also, in case I forget to mention, the client relations officer reports quarterly and has a meeting with our board. So he has a dotted line over to management, obviously, so he can get paid and all the things that go along with that. But his formal reporting is actually to the board on what complaints are. So there's no question there's a process that needs to be improved around the rigor, around the forms, the intake forms on those kinds of things. We are designing intake forms. We are adding additional oversight. If you think about separation of duty, having one person look at it and say, and I'm not questioning Tim's judgment, but if you don't have multiple people saying, is that really a complaint or not, then you really got the judgment of the client relations officer to rely on that. And so we're adding additional oversight and eyes on that process. So with some rigor on immediately on how things are coming in, having discussions about and documenting those things, have better job of documentation, and multiplies with a manager and Tim looking at to make someone out of our corporate side that's not in Shelley's shop that can look at things and say, is this a complaint? Is it not a complaint? Tim also has extensive experience. He was not just a case manager, but he managed one of our major claims units at one time early in his career. And we are also going to take a look across Canada to find out what others are doing. We've started that process, and to bring back what are the best things we can learn from others, whether it's BC or Ontario, in terms of their complaints process and how they actually manage that and how they report out on it.
Mr. Burgar, you'd like to comment?
If I could just follow up on what Stuart has been saying. Tim does report directly into the board, so that's his line of sight in terms of accountability. I want to be really, really clear about this. The Auditor General's recommendation is around the process, as Stuart's been outlining, and it's about proper process and best practice around that. It in no way was around Tim's actual work and the output of his work. He's just an incredible individual. He has incredible ethics. His moral compass is completely headed in the right direction always. And I think in a funny way, because of his integrity, you kind of sleep well at night. You don't really worry about things that Tim is deciding on. When I saw the Auditor General's recommendation, though, as a lawyer, I went, oh my God, of course, he's right. It's absolutely right. There should be a way to oversee this better and have a check and a balance in a sense. So I really let Tim down on that, and we took immediate steps to correct that. So, but I just want to be really clear about Tim himself. Thank you.
Mr. Jessup?
Thank you, folks. And I asked that question so that you have an opportunity to kind of talk about the positive things that were going on. And I'd have to echo the work that the support that Tim has provided our office ongoing over the past, since 2013, since I've been around. It's been very positive to have him in our corner to manage those or field those complaints with constituents from my riding, and certainly good to hear that there's like everything else, there's always room for improvement, and we're trying to take as big bites as we can towards that. With respect to obviously there's a lot of information coming and going from the individual worker, from the employer, from medical staff. How does your office, through the chair, how does your office manage the intake and keeping that information and ensuring that individuals' privacy is protected, and what are you doing to improve upon what you're already doing?
Mr. MacLean.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman. I think that's a really important question. Privacy, we're stewards of a lot of data, as we've talked about today. We've got a lot of things coming in from doctors' offices, from advocates. There's all kinds of different people that contribute to a file. There's no situation where it's okay to share somebody's information. We collect it for a reason to collect it. That's the reason we collect it, and we share it. For context, I'd like to just speak about an improvement that we're making around privacy. Just to put it in context, we've already talked about 24,000 claims a year. About 1,500 times a year, 1,400, we would have an appeal. In those appeals, on an annual basis, about half of them are with longer-term disability people who have been injured a long time ago, and about half of them are current people that we're working with that perhaps had a no decision, and they're appealing that decision. The Auditor General, in their report, there's about 200 times a year that we have an employer ask for a photocopy of the file in the appeal system. And they did find almost 50% of the time, they found that we were missing things in what's called a redaction process. So what that means is that basically our staff then have to take a photocopy, because we're dealing with a lot of paper files, as we talked about. We're still in the Stone Ages in some ways with some of this stuff. So they photocopy a file. A file could have 1,000 pages in it. And we go through that, and we might get it in some places and not get it in some places. I was of the belief, and I've always reported to the board, that we have a privacy culture. We take it very seriously. We have regular reports to executive committee from our general counsel on breaches of security, that kind of thing. I was quite frankly blown away when I found out the learnings around the redaction process. Took steps immediately, talked to Shelley. Shelley's the head of operations. We've added resources around that already, so more multiple eyes looking at it. We also have privacy training on an annual basis with every employee. So we do have a best practice approach that we received through the privacy commissioner with all the different steps, the foundational approach that we've utilized and implemented. We take it seriously. We take this seriously, and there's no breach of information where we're sharing a drug that an employee's taking perhaps for blood pressure. We share that with the employer when it's got nothing to do with the fact that they hurt themselves. That's unacceptable. I apologize for that, and we will do better.
Mr. Jessup.
Thank you so much for that reassurance. In terms of some of the individuals and files that have come through my office, they've shared I guess an expression that they were concerned about the use of an in-house medical opinion rather than that of their own family doctor or their own source. As I understood it, when we first went through the presentation of this report, I received feedback that there was an opportunity for individual workers to put forward an opinion or submit feedback from their own, from a source of their own decision. Through the chair, could you provide some commentary with respect to the in-house versus the addition of a personal suggestion?
Mr. MacLean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's another great question. So first of all, just to be really clear, the only one who makes a decision on a file, an injured worker's file, is the caseworker. So it is a composite of a lot of information. So medical advisors don't say pay this or don't pay this, just like the doctor can say, we believe this is work-related. They give you the information. The caseworker is actually the one who makes the decision. We have independent medical advisors. They are all doctors of medicine. They all have the Hippocratic Oath. They've all been through all of that. We believe they're characters of the highest regard, and they provide advice to the caseworker on everything in a file. So if they look at the file and they've got a specialist saying this, and they may have a physiotherapist that's saying something completely different. We may have another doctor that says something completely different. And the medical advisor helps the caseworker understand what's going on in the file so that they can make the appropriate decision, because clearly these decisions are financial decisions for the system, and they're also very important for the injured worker to make sure we get the decision right. We can't make mistakes. That we need to be absolutely crystal clear on that. So we do have a team of medical advisors. We have a chief medical officer, and that team supports Shelley in her casework. And Shelley, did you want to add to that?
Mr. Rowan.
Thank you. So, and to be clear, the role of the medical advisor is never to take the place of the treating physician. But as Stuart said, our medical advisors are all certified family physicians, and they have additional certification in occupational medicine, in evaluation, all of that. And they're experienced in evaluating and looking at complex data. So they provide support to caseworkers to interpret medical information that's coming to them. And often that medical information can be conflicting. For the injured worker themselves, they are able to see any physician that they want. They can get opinions from their family doctor, they can see specialists, and so we don't restrict who a worker sees. They're able to see the physician of their choice.
Mr. Jessup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as I said, I would try to end on a positive note. There's been some changes over I think it was the last couple of years with respect to the inclusion of post-traumatic stress disorder as an allowed, if that's probably not the right word, but assumptive, my mouth isn't working properly. Presumptive coverage for post-traumatic stress disorder. Can you provide an update on the status of that initiative? Perhaps the number of claims that have come in and how you got to the list of eligible professions that are going to be covered.
Ms. Rowan.
Thank you. I can speak to the experience we've had, and the department actually led the regulations or is in charge of the regulations, so they may want to speak to that separately. So the presumption for PTSD for frontline and emergency response workers came in at the end of October 2018, and we have seen an increase in people applying for benefits. There is no question. When you look at the numbers over time, in 2017, we had 64 claims for PTSD. In 2018, that doubled. And the majority of those claims are coming from the population that's in the presumption, and so that includes paramedics, police, fire, corrections, sheriffs, healthcare workers. Whenever I give a list, I always forget someone. But the majority of those claims are coming, in this list, are coming from paramedics and corrections. So we've also had a great dialogue through the development of the regulations and development of the legislation. There's been a good discussion with the first responder community, and they gave us a lot of input on that. There's no question to eliminate some of the hurdles to benefits was important. And they also gave the WCB advice in how we provide care and support for them. And they also talked a lot about prevention and awareness, that it's important to have the right supports and structures in place to provide treatment and care for people when they're in crisis or when they need it. But it's just, or maybe even more important, to begin the work collectively on how we can prevent and build awareness around PTSD. So we have progress on all those fronts. The presumption is in, people are applying for benefits. The WCB has reorganized the way we do that work. We're getting better access to healthcare providers, particularly psychology and psychiatry, like people asked us to. And our board has supported us by adding additional caseworkers so that we can provide a more in-depth service. And we've also brought the first responder community together to talk about how do we work together to build awareness and think about prevention of PTSD in workplaces to begin with. So big progress. We're far from done, but big progress on all fronts.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to you, we're going to be up against a time crunch with the next round of questioning. It's usually 12, 13, 15 minutes, right around there per side.
The second round will be 8 minutes. You have 4 minutes left.
So I wanted to put a motion to extend the time allowed for public accounts. Do you want me to do that now, or do you want to wait till after the questions? Because we're going to. How about
if we just do it after we get through this round?
So I appreciate it. Yep.
Mr. Levine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank WCB team here this morning for your presentation and comments. I do want to put on the record the acknowledgement and accommodation really for the tremendous turnaround in the unfunded liability. I was here asking questions during the days of payouts for long-term pain and suffering, which were immense, and to have moved from the 20% to 90 is really a tremendous achievement for a corporation. So I wanted to put that on the record. One of the areas the Auditor General talked about was the monitoring training for staff, and this is going to be critical during the transition, the transformative period. Mr. MacLean did reference, staff competency, low turnover, although some positions currently unfilled. I'm wondering if are you coming from a position of strong professional development and a strong culture of training and renewal of staff? Mr. MacLean.
Mr. MacLean.
Thank you for the question. I do believe that our organization invests in its people. We do have a culture of training. We do train people. And in fact, if you look at the Auditor General's report, it does highlight changes that we need to make, especially in documentation of that training when it's taking place. And there's no question there are some circumstances where we have not trained people, specifically some of the ones that were, even about our own staff safety, which is of a concern for me when we miss defensive driving or we miss first aid. All of our caseworkers I believe, are competent. We have competent people. They are trained. They are given the support that they need to actually do their job, and we believe in our staff, and we believe that that's one of our strengths. There's no question as we go through this transition that with new tools and new ways of going about doing things, people are struggling a little bit, and there's no question about that. And we've been stepping up to that challenge by adding additional resources, by providing coaching. I spoke about some of these things earlier, having people available to support people as they go through that change. The organization has well-established values that most people in the organization would know what our values are. They would be able to recite them. I think there's a strong connection to our mandate. So if someone works in IT, they feel strongly proud of the ads that run on television, for example. So we have this where people believe they're making a difference, that they're leaving the province better than they found it throughout their career. And that level of commitment has people wanting to be trained and wanting to be the best that they can be. And that culture of excellence comes under Shelley. I'm going to ask Shelley if she wants to add anything additional if we have time. Mr. MacLean.
Order, please see if the time for the Liberal caucus is up at this point, but you might have a chance to answer that in the second round. So now we get into the second round. I have here scheduled 8 minutes per caucus. So we'll begin. There was somebody going to make a motion, but not now. Okay, fine. Okay, now we'll turn it over to 8 minutes, PC caucus. Mr. Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to return to the topic of the privacy breaches as outlined in the Auditor General's reports. How many of these privacy breaches occurred?
Mr. MacLean.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. I apologize.
Sorry.
The Auditor General's sample, as I mentioned earlier, we have 200 that we copy approximately annually, files that we copy. They looked at a sample of 20, and in 9 instances, in 9 of those files, they found problems with redaction process that I explained earlier on the record.
Mr. Hammond.
What was the information that was exposed in those 9 breaches?
Mr. MacLean. Mr. MacLean.
I'm going to get in trouble here, aren't I?
No,
What do you do?
just wait for your
Throw me out. Yeah, so there were some of them, as I mentioned earlier, where medication, I think that was a common one. Shelley, would you want to make any other comments about that? I can look it up.
Ms. Rowan.
The majority of them, as I understand it, were medication, or an example would be medication that somebody's taking for personal reasons, that somehow that got referenced in medical documentation, and we then inconsistently redacted that or removed it from the file. So when you look at the big claim files, as Stuart said, often they're hundreds of pages long, and the same document may be in there multiple times. So we may have found it the first time and the second time, but missed it the third time. So typically medication.
Mr. Burgar.
I could just add on to what Shelley and Stuart have just said. Let me start with also reinforcing and reiterating that privacy is extremely important. We discuss privacy at the board level consistently. We receive reports on it. We take it very, very seriously. When this recommendation, this finding in the Auditor General's report came out, the board was, very, very keenly interested in understanding the ins and outs of that. So it's exceptionally important issue. And as Stuart said, we accept responsibility for that, and we apologize for that. Just contextual information, though, just so that I think often privacy breaches are considered to be massive privacy breaches, like Citibank or one of those situations. What Shelley is talking about when there was a failure to redact medical information, or there was medical information shared that shouldn't have been shared, it was with the employer. It's not a broad public sharing of information. It's with the employer. It's in the context of a system where the employer is allowed to have information. It doesn't excuse the fact that it happened. I want to be clear about that. But I also want the members to understand that this is not out on Facebook. It's not out on Instagram or anything like that. It's not one of those massive kinds of leaks. Thank you.
Mr. Hum.
I'm sure all of you can appreciate privacy is of the utmost importance in the digital age. And certainly in the last year, privacy breaches has been an ongoing issue. And certainly, it highlights the importance of all of us being as diligent as we can when it comes to the personal sensitive information of the people we have the privilege of serving. How does a file get the go-ahead from a manager for it to be sent to an employer? Essentially, what process, can you outline the process that allowed this to happen?
Ms. Rowan?
When we get a request in the appeal process from an employer, it goes to, we have a team of people who photocopy files. And in this circumstance, employers are requesting the file, but often workers will request a copy of their file as well. So we have people who copy in both circumstances. They then go download everything that we have electronically, combine it with the paper, and make a photocopy. And then a person goes through that and identifies any information that is not relevant to the claim file, and will eliminate that. And then the manager does a second check of that to review the file. So a very manual process. So we recognize that the process we had in place clearly was not thorough enough. And so we've added an additional step to that. We've hired 2 additional people to if I photocopy a claim file, then we have, and I do the original redaction, then we have somebody else now will be able to go through it and essentially check my work. And we're going to hire an additional person to do the second check for the manager as well. So in a manual world, and this was human error in these circumstances, we felt the initial step, immediate step we had to take was add double checks to that process, and we're doing that at both the employee frontline initial photocopy and reading process, and also at the manager process.
Mr. Hum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've spoken about accountability. I'm curious, internally, what are the consequences for a caseworker for passing documentation to an employer, I guess, without a manager's review? Could you outline what the consequences are within the context of accountability?
Ms. Rowan.
There are kind of 2 sides of privacy in this kind of situation, that it's important that a person be held accountable for what's happened. If they have made an egregious decision, that they be held accountable for that. And it's also important that we understand where the flaws in our processes might be and learn from that. So we've tried to develop a culture where we encourage employees to self-identify if they realize that they've made an error and they have committed a privacy breach, so that we can then have a corporate learning of that. We can all learn from what's happened so that we can be better. And if under from an HR perspective, an employee has done something egregious, our collective agreement outlines the terms of which an employee will be held accountable for their actions on this or anything else. But from an overall privacy point of view, we really look at it, we've looked at it as also a learning opportunity. And we don't want people to keep things secret when they've made a mistake. We want them to tell us so that we can all learn from their experience.
Order, please. The time for the PC caucus is up. We'll turn now to the NDP caucus. Ms. Roberts.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to ask some questions related to the audit. But I am actually going to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about injury rates particularly in the home care and long-term care sector, which is a topic that might have come to this committee because it was touched on in the November 2017 Auditor General's report on managing home care contracts, but unfortunately we haven't had the opportunity to call that report. There was a 2018 report called Workplace Safety for Nova Scotia's home care, long-term care, and disability support sectors that someone from your organization was involved with at the level of a steering committee. And, you know, some of the findings in this report are very, very concerning. I'm just going to read one quote, one paragraph that really jumps out at me. A key finding from both the research and stakeholder consultations is that the current rate of workplace injury is having a major impact on staffing shortages. This is in the long-term care and home care and disability support program workplaces. There's a vicious cycle where injured workers are off the job, leaving the employer short-staffed, which in turn puts those remaining workers at higher risk of injuring themselves. Now, the report talks about how there was some significant work done from 2013 to 2018 or maybe it was starting 2009 to 2015 to reduce workplace injuries and sort of avert a trend that was emerging, and yet we're again seeing increases to workplace injuries. So I'm wondering, you know, at the level of our system and really of the well-being of Nova Scotians in our province, because we know that we do have an aging demographic and that these services are very important, and they're also funded through the government of Nova Scotia. You know, what can you share about how you see possibly changing this trend line around workplace injuries in these very important sectors?
Mr. MacLean.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm really happy to get that question. One of the things that keeps us up at night is when we have a trend in injury that's getting worse. There's no question that the most dangerous occupation in this province, you might be surprised, is a home care worker. More so than construction, more so than fishing. And we've seen industries have major turnaround through having dialogue about what are the major risks and how do we actually be strategic about how we deal with them. We've worked very closely with our colleagues at the Department of Labor and Advanced Education, for example, with construction and with fishing. In those two examples, construction at one time had 1,500 time-loss injuries. Today they have around 500 time-loss injuries, as an example. A safety culture is emerging or has emerged in that sector. The fishing sector may be the best example, very difficult to change things, where we've seen the costs go down by 50%. Why am I talking about that? Because in home care, what we're trying to do with that action plan is a similar approach, where we say, what are all the parties that can influence change? Because one of the intractable challenges of being in workers' compensation is I have to get to a nursing home or a home care situation, have that worker make a different decision that makes them stay safer. So how do you change the way they think? This is about culture, this is about what supports we give them, and then what do we do when they're injured? And there's no question that there are alarming numbers. I know Minister Glavine and I've talked about this when he was health minister, and currently we're having Minister Delory. We had an update with him a couple of weeks ago. I'm the executive sponsor, one of the executive sponsors on that group, which has 4, which are all from different departments. We have a steering committee that involves the unions. So the conversation needs to be robust. We're including the unions. We have a bunch of themes: slips and falls, safe lift and transfer, mental health, violence in the workplace. These are not surprises, and return to work. Those are key themes. But for me, if I would take the opportunity, I think there's also an opportunity for government, because you're the funder, to require things like, whether it's procurement, it takes visible leadership to change things. And we know that what we've seen in industry, where manufacturing is improved, where fishing is improved, construction, the biggest thing is figuring out what you need to do and then putting the resources towards it. The good news is this healthcare action plan has a bunch of tangible, strategic steps towards creating safer workplaces. And we saw the announcement of the government last week or a week or two ago, where a bunch of money was committed towards nonviolent crisis intervention training and personal protective equipment. I think those things are table stakes. We need to train our people. We need to keep them safe. And to your point, if you've got 300 or 400 home care workers that are home on time loss injury, that's not helping anyone serve the injured workers or the elderly population in this province. So we all recognize it. I think government recognizes it. The stakeholders recognize the problem. The unions recognize the problem. And at workers' compensation, it's our top priority to provide support to the government, to the Department of Health, to the different stakeholders, to the unions, to the people of this province as we move forward and create a safety culture where we see that trend go in the opposite direction and have those people stay at work. Everyone in Nova Scotia has a right to go to work and come home to their family at the end of the day. That's the number one thing. They have a right to know about it, health and safety. They've got a right to participate, and they have a right to refuse. Those are indoctrinated in the legislation. And we have challenges, no question, about resourcing, especially in healthcare. But that's not the biggest thing that's our opportunity. We have to move from knowing about it to caring about it. And that's what happens in every industry where we see cultural change. We need the worker to understand that's a priority for the managers. We need the managers to understand that's a priority for the administrators. And we need the administrators to understand that's a priority for the Department of Health. And we all need to do our part. All of us at the table here, where we're working together with the government, with all of us, to try to change things. If we can do it in fishing, with the intractability of that culture where they had, and they've seen all those changes take place, and we could go on and on and on about that, which we wouldn't have time for. The health, we're poised for making some big changes and things being better because we've got the plan and we've got some resources. We're all chipping in resources, and we'd like to see the changes we've seen in those other sectors.
Ms. Roberts, you have about a minute and a half.
That was one question. Well, with a minute and a half, I'll to say that I really appreciate that answer, and it does strike me that that the government has not played the full role that it needs to play in owning this problem and also in owning the solutions. Because certainly we know that these employees, by and large, are earning relatively low incomes. So number one, there are real significant personal consequences for them when they are then earning only a percentage of their lost earnings, because already the earnings that they were making were qualifying them for a very low income life. But also, at the level of the province, one of the interesting things in this report is that the costs of people being off don't reflect the total impact of backfilling staff, because as a province, then we have to pay, or those nonprofit nursing home providers have to pay for the staff to backfill those individuals who are off. So, and we know that the low resources in nursing homes and in long-term care actually contribute to the injuries, because you don't have enough people to operate the lifts that would safely.
Order, please. The time for the NDP Caucus has expired. We'll now turn it over to the Liberal Caucus. You have 8 minutes, Mr. Levine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And unlike my colleague, I like to provide a compliment at the start of my conversation. But I was pleased that both the board chair and the CEO spoke so strongly about the work of Mr. McGuinness and his role dealing with complaints in that area. I've been here for 16 years, and so therefore 16 years of Mr. McGuinness on occasion coming to my office. I only give him the most complex cases, and for that reason I did want to state that my constituents go away happy with the fact that he's been able to bring together the employer, the employee's position, the medical, and WCB's policies and regulations. So when constituents may not get the exact result they want, but they like the process. and I think that speaks so strongly for itself. I did want to go back and hear from Ms. Rowan on how you view that culture of training and how it works out on a day-to-day basis, especially with the challenges of the years now you'll be in transformation of WCB.
Ms. Rowan.
Thank you. As Stuart said, we do have a learning and development culture, and we try to do continuous development we do onboarding when new employees come, and then continuous development as our work changes. And we've seen a lot of change in claims over the past 10 years. Claims today are not the same as they were 10 years ago, and our employees are good, solid, dedicated people who've been there a long time, and we've needed to update our processes as we've gone. What the Auditor General found was, or one of the challenges we had with training is in our documentation, that, as Stuart said, we've had challenges with lots of our systems, and one of them is we have requirements for training for employees, requirements for qualifications, requirements for training, and we had no way for managers, employees to know when your next round of that training was due. You had to basically remember that my first aid training expires this year and I need to go and get it. And so one of the tools that we're currently putting in place, we've recently introduced a learning management system that's giving us better documentation of what we have, and it will now enable managers to monitor and employees to monitor where am I in the training cycle, when is it due, and then I know the timing and I know that it's been completed. And that learning management system can then report to people like me so that I know from my team overall who has kept pace with what their requirements are. So improvements to come in that area.
Mr. Levine.
Yes, either the board chair or CEO, do you do exit interviews with employees? Some government departments and companies now will give a worker leaving either retirement or leaving the profession an opportunity to speak candidly about their work experience. I'm just wondering if that is part of what you do for reflection.
Mr. MacLean.
Sir. I can't say that it happens in every instance, but I know that certainly it does happen regularly. The people in our organization, as I mentioned earlier, they stay for a long time. There's a lot of people with long service awards. You look at the cumulative years, it's always almost shocking how when you have this many 25-year, this many 20, this many 15. So what happens when someone leaves our organization, not only do they have an exit interview, because they, I've been there for 33 years, so the staff call me by my first name. I know them all. I see them in the hallway and up and down, and believe me, there's no lack of candor from our team around what needs to change. And the ongoing conversation is really important. But the exit interview is also something that we would utilize to find out what did you learn, why are you leaving. It just doesn't happen very often. And I don't know that we measure compliance on that, Minister, but we certainly take open dialogue with our people, and we try to have regular communications. I think, Shelley already spoke about this, but we do have high compliance with having their personal performance appraisal done. We weren't doing a good job with documentation, and I believe the systems that we're implementing will help us in terms of not just acknowledging that they're getting done, but allow us to have oversight, because Shelley will get that report, then I'm going to get that report, and Rod's going to ask that question as we respond to this through the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee to make sure that everyone is having their performance appraisals done. And not just that we're having mid-year conversations with people and exit interviews. I think that's a great idea, and we got to make sure that we're doing that. So,
Mr. Levine.
Yes, I wanted to just go back. I know there's been a reference this morning to, again, complex cases, and when you get conflicting medical information and even the employer's position on how the injury happened and so forth. Is this a team-based decision, or does it come down to one individual then deciding that this claim needs to be fully supported or not? I'm just wondering how that process unfolds.
Ms. Brown, with less than 2 minutes left.
Okay. The ultimate decision maker on every claim is the caseworker. the caseworker can draw on resources to help them do that. We talked about the medical advisors. They can help them interpret medical information. They have information from the employer. They have all the information from the worker. And we also have a team of policy people who help them interpret our policies to make sure that they're adjudicating in compliance with the Act and the policies. So they have all kinds of supports around them. But at the core, the caseworker has the responsibility to make the decision.
Mr. Levine.
I just wanted to follow up, and that would also pertain to when a claimant goes before a panel, you know, that final area of reviewing a case would come back to the caseworker in those cases?
Ms. Rowan.
So in the appeal process, if I understand you correctly, at the WCB level, the internal appeal would go to a hearing officer who would be the decision maker. And then at the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal, which is an external appeals tribunal, that would be heard either by an appeal commissioner or at times in a complex case, there may be a panel. And those decisions, either the panel or the commissioner will make that decision, and then if there is if the WCB's decision has been overturned, it will come back to the WCB to implement. The Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal, they are with the Department of Justice, so they're outside the Department of Labor system.
Thank you, Mr. Levine. You have 13 seconds. You want to make a statement?
I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to, for all members, to drill down on the auditor's report.
Order, please. That concludes the time allotted for questions put by the committee to members. It does, in fact, provide the opportunity for you people to make some closing remarks. So the floor is yours. Mr. MacLean.
First of all, as the CEO on the performance, the performance audit clearly is under my purview to respond. As been said by the governors of the system, our deputy and our chair of our board and our independent board that governs us, we will have appropriate oversight. We will implement all of these recommendations, and we do understand the seriousness of privacy, the seriousness of complaints, the seriousness of timeliness, the seriousness of documentation, the seriousness of properly training people, and the seriousness of having performance appraisals. These are all very important issues to us and have provided us insight. I'd like to thank the chair and the committee today on behalf of the people who are here. I also want to thank Mr. Pickup and his staff, who I believe, as I mentioned earlier in my comments, were very collegial. They helped us understand. We've had meetings with them, and we found that the findings here, while there were some surprises for us, that's always a little bit of a concern for me, but we're acting on those things. We take it very seriously. As somebody who's been in the system for a long, long period of time, there's nothing, I want to just say on the record, there's nothing more important than keeping people safe at work. There is no objective productivity measure, economic measure. There's nothing as important. The people who live in this province returning home safely to their families at the end of the day. That's our mandate. We weigh into that. We lean into that, all of us, every day. And we are a committed group of individuals, both at this table, and we really believe that that's an important thing to stick with and remember in the end of the day. We will make these changes and improve from workers' compensation's perspective.
Thank you. Mr. Montgomerie.
First of all, this is the best public accounts meeting I've ever attended.
It's a good chair, that's why.
But seriously, the one comment I'd make, I have the privilege every day of working with everything from university presidents to construction companies to union leaders, et cetera, and you get a pretty good flavor of whether those organizations are really working hard on behalf of their members. And the thing that impressed me about the WCB when this report came out, particularly around compliance and privacy, those are serious issues. And we met with WCB right away, and they owned it right away, just as they've owned it here today. But more importantly, they put resources to it right away. So I just want to reassure Nova Scotians that 25,000 Nova Scotians interact with the WCB every year. And I think they're doing a really excellent job of trying to, as we all say, get better. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you on behalf of the committee for being here with us this morning and answering some of the questions as related to the Auditor General's report and a little bit beyond, too. I think it provided an opportunity to learn more about the workings of WCB. So, again, we thank you. Committee members there are some items to be brought up under business. We'll just give these individuals a chance to gather up their things, and there are a couple of items that we have to deal with. I can't hear you. Sorry. And order, please. We'll get back to the business at hand as far as the committee is concerned. Before we begin, Mr. Maguire, you had a motion that you'd like to put forward.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. We are on a bit of a time crunch, and there's some committee business to do. So, with the permission of the committee, I'd like to extend public accounts till noon. I'd like to add an extra hour on just to give us lots of time, just in case. We might not use the entire hour, but we just want to make sure that we have the time for all the committee business.
The request is that we add 1 hour to the length of the meeting. Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you explain the specifics as to why you want to extend it by a full hour?
Mr. Maguire.
We have committee business, and we want to make sure we have lots of time to deal with it. Simple as that.
Mr. Hallman.
Again, could you be specific? What business will warrant an extra hour? Could you explain that?
Mr. Maguire.
We'd just like to call for the motion to be put on the floor to be voted on. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to remind everyone that it has to be unanimous consent to extend the time, correct? Okay, you will ask for a vote. All those in favor of extending for 1 hour, please say aye. Contrary minded. Motion is defeated. Okay, so we, on your agenda, there are a couple of items that have to be looked after. And the first is, Mr. Maguire.
Put a motion on the floor. Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion. I move that the topic for September 11th on the use of P3s for the twinning of the highway between Antigonish and Pictou be removed from public accounts agenda. This topic is not a topic of an AG report, which is the focus of public accounts, and it's better suited for another committee.
Okay, we have that motion. Everybody, Ms. Lavon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to begin with a couple of questions for the clerk, if I may, some procedural questions.
Sure.
Number one, I'm wondering, is it within our rules of order that members abstaining or dissenting on an original motion are empowered to, at a later meeting, move to rescind the same motion?
The clerk.
I'll have to consult legal counsel.
Legal counsel, Nicole.
So every motion is independent. So whether someone abstains or votes from one motion doesn't preclude voting at a subsequent motion. Each motion is considered independent motions.
Ms. LeBon.
Thank you. And then if that's the case, are there any differences in the proportion of members required for the rescindment to be successful between motions to rescind with no notice given and those made with advance notice?
Ms. Harrison.
When voting on a motion, the rules just state the majority of voices shall carry.
Ms. LeBon.
Thanks. I'm going to get to my comments in a second, but I just want to clarify these things. Robert's Rules of Order state that in this case, if work relating to the motion has already been carried out, it cannot be rescinded. Is there a similar procedural rule that's applicable here in the House?
Ms. Harrison.
Could you repeat the question, sorry?
Ms. LeBon.
Yeah, so in Robert's Rules of Order, if work on a particular motion has already begun, then the motion cannot be rescinded. I could give a banal example, but I think that's clear. And I'm just wondering if there's like a comparable rule of the Legislative Assembly. So if something has been done on the motion, which we're talking about right now, then can it be rescinded?
Ms. Harrison.
Under our rules, which is the O'Brien and Bosk is one of the House of Commons rules that we follow, that a decision of the committee shall stand. However, a motion to rescind can be successful, which will remove the previous motion, and then a further motion can be made.
Ms. LeBon.
Okay, I think that's it for my questions. But I would like to make a comment. So I strongly oppose the motion on the floor, Mr. Chair. This has been brought to our committee before, and there are many reasons why I oppose it. The first one is there is nothing in our mandate as a Public Accounts Committee in Nova Scotia that we must only deal with Auditor General reports. And this is what my colleague, Mr. Maguire, has brought forward as the reasoning for removing this topic from the agenda. We are mandated to discuss items or topics that address the spending of public accounts in Nova Scotia. And when we look at this particular topic, we are talking about millions and millions of dollars of public money. There is excellent evidence been provided by several sources. I'm sorry if my microphone's popping. Provided by several sources, including a recent report by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, that the planning to do infrastructure builds, in this case, highways in Nova Scotia using a P3 model will cost Nova Scotians millions and millions of dollars more than a traditional non-P3 build. To me, this one fact is enough to make sure that this topic remains in the public accounts, on the agenda of the Public Accounts Committee. Notwithstanding all of those things, this committee voted to talk about the topic. This committee voted to bring this topic forward. Witnesses have been scheduled. It is in the public interest to discuss this in this room at this committee. And we now see that the governing caucus, Liberals, want to take away this topic from this discussion. My sense is that they simply just want this discussion to go away, for people to forget about it, and I, for one, will not let this go. I will continue to talk about this until the public is well informed about the dangers of using a P3 build, in particular on the highway that is in question. So I don't know if there are other people who would like to speak, but I will end it there for now, but I may come back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hellman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, let's not forget what's happened essentially since the fall sitting of 2018. The government has seriously limited this committee's ability to question public spending and the execution of public administration, which we know are core mandates of this committee going back many, many years. They've limited the topics in order to limit opposition to ask fundamental questions. Now think about that. Questions to government are key to get better public policy. And right now we're in a situation where We've gone through, as opposition parties, all the formal processes to get a topic that's outside of the Auditor General's report that is of great importance to Nova Scotians, that falls under the category of public spending. Millions, as my colleague pointed out, in public spending. Also, the enormous amount of public administration that's going to be devoted to that. It's within the scope. It was proposed at subcommittee, went through all the formal channels, and we get now to this process, we now get to this situation where somehow it's not convenient for government. So the fact of the matter is, they're using their majority on this committee to once again limit the key topics that should be coming to public accounts. We should be trying to strike a balance between those three fundamental pillars of questioning public spending. Let's not forget we have an $11.5 billion budget. Yes, the Auditor General reports are critical, they are important, but there's other key things that have to be factored in. An $11.5 billion budget, and we don't even have an opportunity at public accounts to raise topics that are in the public's interest. So, Mr. Chair, this is a major, major problem. I really think what's happening here, the Liberals are simply using their majority to silence a topic that I think is of great importance to Nova Scotians. And this is, once again, you know, public accounts, the erosion of public accounts under this government continues.
Thank you. Your calling question?
No.
There are others that want to speak, but we need unanimous consent to continue this topic until we finish with it. Do we have unanimous consent to keep going until we finish on this topic?
No.
No? Okay. Because it was 11 o'clock. Okay. Anyway, that there are still items that have to be looked after. So, okay, so meeting stands adjourned.